He gave away his last meal to a stranger. By sunrise, 300 riders would surround his land. Samuel Whitaker did not know that yet. All he knew was the quiet sound of the wind sliding across the dry plains of northern Arizona and the hollow feeling in his stomach that had been there for 3 days. The year was 1874, and drought had a way of teaching a man how small he truly was. The grass had turned the color of old straw. The creek behind his cabin had shrunk to a ribbon of muddy water barely 2 feet wide, and the cattle that once filled his pasture had either wandered off or been sold to keep the bank from taking the ranch altogether. Samuel Whitaker stood on the crooked porch of his small wooden cabin, staring across 30 empty acres that used to mean something. The boards creaked under his boots as the evening wind pushed dust across the yard. A single horse stood near the fence, ribs faintly visible beneath its dull coat. The animal lifted its head slowly, as if even that small movement required more strength than the day could spare. Samuel tipped his hat back and looked toward the horizon where the sun was dropping low, painting the desert sky with long orange streaks. A man could measure his life out here by sunsets. And lately, every one of them looked the same. Inside the cabin, sitting on a rough pine table, was the last meal Samuel Whitaker owned in the world. Half a loaf of hard bread, a small tin of beans, and a cup of water drawn from the shrinking creek before sunset. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep a man standing one more day. Maybe 2 if he was careful. Samuel stepped inside the cabin and closed the door against the rising wind. The room was simple. 1 table, 1 chair, a narrow bed in the corner. The smell of dry wood and dust filled the air. He sat down slowly and looked at the bread like it was something sacred. Out here, food was more than food. It was time. Time to keep breathing. Time to find another chance. He broke off a small piece and raised it halfway to his mouth when something outside stopped him. At first it was just a sound carried by the wind. Not loud, not urgent, just a faint scrape against the porch boards. Samuel lowered the bread slowly. The plains had a way of delivering trouble when a man least expected it. He stood, walked to the door, and pushed it open again. The sky had dimmed to that strange blue color that comes just before night settles across the desert. For a moment he saw nothing but dust drifting across the yard. Then his eyes adjusted. A figure sat against the wooden post near the edge of the porch. A woman. Her dark hair hung loose across her shoulders, and her clothes were torn from travel. One hand pressed against her side, as if she had been walking farther than her body wanted to allow. Samuel didn't move right away. Out here, strangers were rare, and strangers who arrived after sunset usually carried trouble with them. The woman lifted her head slowly, her eyes catching the fading light. Even from 10 feet away, Samuel could see the exhaustion in her face, the kind that came from days on the trail without rest. She tried to speak, but only a faint breath escaped her lips. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The wind moved through the dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote called across the valley. Samuel Whitaker looked at the woman, then back toward the empty plains behind her. No horses, no riders, no tracks he could see from the porch. Just the endless quiet of the frontier settling in for the night. He knew 2 things immediately. The first was that the woman was Apache. The second was that he only had enough food for 1 person. Samuel Whitaker stood there in the doorway with the last piece of bread still in his hand, watching the stranger struggle to stay upright against the porch post. And somewhere deep in the quiet corners of his mind, a thought passed through like a slow-moving cloud. By morning, everything about this lonely ranch would change. Samuel Whitaker stood in the doorway for several seconds while the evening wind pushed dust across the porch boards, and the woman leaned against the wooden post like someone whose strength had been slowly drained mile after mile. Out here, a man learned to read small details. The way her shoulders moved with slow, careful breaths. The dust covering. The hem of her dress nearly up to her knees. The faint marks of a long trail behind her boots that had carried her across land where water could be 10 miles apart. She had walked far. Samuel stepped down from the porch, his boots pressing into the dry dirt, and stopped about 6 feet from where she sat. The fading light showed more of her face now. She was young, maybe 25, though exhaustion had carved deeper lines around her eyes. A thin leather cord hung around her neck with a small turquoise stone resting just above the collar of her dress. Her gaze lifted slowly and met his with a quiet steadiness that surprised him. People who were afraid did not usually hold eye contact that long. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The desert had gone quiet except for the wind brushing the tall grass and the soft creak of the loose porch board behind him. Samuel finally cleared his throat. His voice came out rough from a day without speaking. "You have come a long way," he said. The woman did not answer right away. Her lips moved slightly before a faint voice emerged. "My name is Ayana." The words were careful but clear. Her English carried a soft accent that rolled gently across each syllable. Samuel nodded once. He had heard Apache voices before in trading towns many miles south, but rarely this far north where ranchers kept to themselves and travelers chose safer routes. Ayana glanced past him toward the open door of the cabin where the dim lantern light touched the wooden floor just inside. Then her eyes drifted down to the bread still resting in Samuel's hand. It was not a hungry look exactly. It was more like someone recognizing the answer to a question they had been asking themselves for hours. Samuel followed her gaze and looked at the piece of bread between his fingers. Half a loaf remained on the table behind him along with the tin of beans and the cup of water he had drawn from the creek before sunset. The last meal he owned in the world. He knew what it meant to give that away. Out here food was not just comfort. It was distance. Distance between today and tomorrow. Samuel looked back at the woman. She had not asked for anything. She simply sat there leaning against the post, breathing slowly as if each breath required quiet patience. The sky had darkened another shade of blue and the first evening star had appeared above the distant hills. Night would arrive soon, and the desert could grow cold faster than most people expected. Samuel Whitaker had lived on that land long enough to understand one simple truth. When the desert sent someone to your door, turning them away did not make the world safer. It only made it lonelier. He stepped aside and gestured toward the cabin. "You should come inside before the cold sets in," he said. Ayana studied him for a second longer, as if measuring the weight of the invitation. Then she slowly pushed herself up from the porch post. Her movement was careful but steady. When she took her first step onto the porch board, it creaked softly beneath her weight. Samuel held the door open, and the warm lantern glow spilled across the wooden porch. Inside the cabin, the small table waited with the bread and beans, sitting in quiet silence like witnesses to a decision that had not yet been spoken aloud. Samuel Whitaker placed the bread back on the table and reached for a second plate from the shelf above the stove. For the first time in 3 days, the cabin did not feel quite as empty. Ayana stepped across the threshold and paused just inside the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the lantern light while the wind outside brushed softly against the wooden walls. Samuel poured water into a second cup and slid it across the table toward her. She accepted it with both hands and drank slowly, as if every swallow mattered. After a moment, she looked up at him again. Her voice was quiet but steady when she spoke. "You did not ask why I came here." Samuel pulled the chair out and sat down across from her, resting his hat on the table beside the bread. "Out here," he said calmly, "people who walk 20 miles through dry land usually have a reason." The wind outside eased and the ranch settled into that deep frontier silence that often came just before night took full hold of the plains. Neither of them knew it yet, but the quiet of that moment was the last ordinary silence the ranch would know for a long time. Samuel Whitaker sat quietly across the table while the lantern flame moved gently inside the glass chimney and the shadows of the cabin stretched long against the wooden walls. The bread rested between them like something far more valuable than it had seemed an hour earlier. Ayana held the cup of water in both hands, letting the warmth of the room settle into her tired bones before she spoke again. For a long moment, she simply listened to the quiet sounds of the ranch. The faint wind moving outside, the distant call of a night bird somewhere beyond the fence line, the slow creak of the old boards beneath the cabin floor. It was the kind of silence that only existed far away from towns and railroads, the deep frontier quiet where every small sound carried meaning. Samuel reached for the bread and broke it carefully into 2 pieces. The loaf was already hard from the dry air, but it would soften once the beans warmed on the stove. He placed one half in front of Ayana and the other in front of himself. The gesture was simple, almost ordinary, yet both of them seemed to understand that it carried weight far beyond the table. Ayana looked at the bread without touching it at first. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, as if committing every small detail to memory. The rough pine walls, the iron stove standing in the corner, the narrow bed with its neatly folded blanket. Finally, she looked back at Samuel. "This is the last food you have," she said quietly. Samuel did not answer right away. Instead, he reached for the small tin of beans and set it on the stove, turning the lid slightly so the heat could reach the contents. The faint smell of cooked beans soon began to fill the room. He shrugged one shoulder in a slow, easy motion. "Tomorrow always finds something for a man who keeps working," he said. Ayanna studied his face for several seconds, as if searching for something hidden behind the calm tone of his voice. Perhaps she expected hesitation or regret. Instead, she found neither. Samuel Whitaker had lived on dry land long enough to know that worrying about tomorrow rarely filled a man's stomach tonight. When the beans warmed, he divided them into 2 portions and set the plates on the table. The simple meal looked almost humble under the lantern light. Bread, beans, and water. Nothing more. Yet Ayanna accepted the plate with both hands as though it had been prepared for a special gathering. She took a small bite first, chewing slowly as if allowing her body to remember what real food felt like. Samuel ate quietly across from her. Neither of them rushed the meal. Outside, the night had fully settled over the ranch, and the temperature began to fall the way desert nights often did, dropping nearly 20 degrees after sunset. The wind brushed softly against the wooden walls of the cabin, but inside the lantern and stove held a small pocket of warmth. After several minutes, Ayanna placed the last piece of bread on the plate and folded her hands together. Her strength seemed to be returning little by little with each bite. "You have a good heart, Samuel Whitaker," she said. Samuel raised his eyes slightly. People rarely used his full name unless they had traveled far enough to hear it from someone else. He leaned back in his chair and rested one arm on the table. "Most folks would say I only have a small ranch and poor luck with weather," he replied with a faint smile. Ayanna shook her head slowly. "Among my people, kindness is a form of wealth," she said. "Some men carry gold. Some men carry land. Others carry respect." Samuel did not quite know what to say to that. He simply nodded once and continued eating the last of his beans. The lantern light flickered again as the wind outside shifted direction. After a moment, Ayanna reached up and touched the small turquoise stone resting against the leather cord at her neck. The movement was gentle but deliberate. "My people remember when someone shows generosity during a hard season," she said softly. Samuel rested his cup on the table and looked at her more closely now. Out here on the frontier, men often heard promises that vanished with the morning sun. He had learned not to place too much weight on words spoken during long journeys. Still, there was something in Ayanna's voice that carried a quiet certainty. She stood slowly from the chair and moved toward the small window beside the stove. The glass reflected the lantern glow while the dark plains stretched beyond it for miles in every direction. Somewhere out there, the desert night continued its endless silence. Ayanna rested her hand lightly on the window frame. "When dawn comes," she said calmly, "the world around this ranch may look different." Samuel Whitaker followed her gaze into the darkness beyond the fence line. The plains looked exactly as they had every other night of his life. Empty, still, quiet. Yet something about the way she said those words made the silence outside feel deeper than before. The cabin grew quieter as the lantern burned lower and the warmth from the stove slowly spread across the small room. Outside, the plains stretched into darkness that seemed almost endless, the kind of deep frontier night where the horizon disappeared and the sky filled with more stars than most people believed existed. Samuel Whitaker finished the last spoonful of beans and set the tin cup down beside his plate. For a few moments, he simply listened to the stillness around them. The wind had settled, and the land seemed to be resting after a long dry day. Ayanna remained standing near the window, her silhouette outlined by the faint reflection of lantern light against the glass. Her eyes were fixed somewhere far beyond the fence line where the desert rolled outward mile after mile. Samuel leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together. The question that had been quietly forming in his mind finally made its way into the room. "You said the morning might look different," he said calmly. Ayanna did not turn right away. Instead, she continued looking across the dark plains as if she could already see something hidden beyond the hills. The small turquoise stone around her neck caught the lantern light when she shifted slightly. "Among my people," she said softly, "gratitude is not forgotten when the sun rises." Samuel allowed a faint breath of amusement to pass through his nose. Out here, he replied, most folks are too busy worrying about the next rainstorm to remember yesterday. Ayanna finally turned from the window. The calm expression on her face had not changed, but there was something thoughtful in her eyes now, as though she was measuring the distance between two very different worlds. Your land is quiet tonight, she said. Samuel glanced toward the door and listened again. She was right. Usually the night carried small sounds across the ranch. The shuffle of cattle hooves or the rustle of dry grass along the fence line. Tonight there was only stillness. The kind of stillness that made a man aware of every breath he took. Samuel pushed his chair back and stood. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he crossed the room and placed another piece of wood into the stove. The small flames inside brightened for a moment, and the cabin filled with a soft, orange glow. You are welcome to sleep here tonight, he said without looking back. The bed is yours. I can take the chair. Ayanna shook her head gently. I have rested enough already, she replied. Samuel turned toward her again. The exhaustion that had marked her face earlier seemed to be fading now that food and warmth had returned to her strength. Still, there were signs of a long journey in the dust on her clothes and the careful way she moved across the room. She stepped closer to the table and placed the empty cup beside his. Then she paused as though choosing her next words carefully. In the morning I will continue my journey, she said. Samuel nodded once. Travelers passed through this land from time to time, though rarely this far north. The nearest settlement was more than 20 miles away, and most riders preferred routes with easier water access. Well, he said simply, the trail east will lead you toward the river if you keep the hills on your left. It is about 12 miles from here. Ayanna studied him again, the same quiet curiosity returning to her expression. You speak as though you expect the morning to arrive like every other morning, she said. Samuel picked up his hat from the table and brushed a small layer of dust from the brim. For the past 10 years that has usually been the case, he replied. Sunrise, chores, dust, and hoping the clouds remember this part of Arizona. Ayanna allowed the faintest hint of a smile. Then she reached into the small pouch tied at her belt and removed something wrapped carefully in cloth. She placed it on the table between them. Samuel glanced down at the small bundle, but did not touch it. A gift should not be opened until the sun rises, she said gently. Samuel raised one eyebrow slightly, but did not argue. Out here a man learned that travelers carried traditions from places he might never see. He simply nodded and left the bundle where it rested on the table. A few minutes later the lantern light dimmed as the wick burned lower. Samuel stepped toward the door and opened it briefly to look outside. The night air was cool now, and the sky above the plains stretched wide and silent. Everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Empty land, quiet wind, endless stars. Yet when he closed the door and turned back toward the cabin, something inside him felt different, as if the stillness beyond the ranch was quietly waiting for the first light of morning. The night settled deeper over the ranch as the lantern flame shrank to a small golden circle on the wooden table, and the rest of the cabin faded into soft shadows. Samuel Whitaker finally lowered the wick, and the room slipped into darkness except for the faint glow from the stove. Outside the plains stretched quiet and endless beneath a sky filled with cold, bright stars. The desert night carried a different kind of silence than daytime. During the day the wind moved through the grass and insects hummed in the heat, but after midnight the land seemed to pause as though the earth itself was listening. Samuel sat in the chair near the door with his hat resting on his knee, watching the faint outline of the window across the room. Ayanna had taken the narrow bed despite her earlier protest, and within a few minutes her breathing had slowed into the steady rhythm of deep sleep. For a long while Samuel did not sleep at all. Years of ranch life had trained him to wake easily and rest lightly. A man living alone on 30 dry acres could not afford to ignore the sounds of the land around him. Every creak of wood and shift of wind carried information. Yet tonight the ranch seemed unusually still. The horse outside did not move. The loose fence board that usually tapped softly in the breeze remained quiet. Even the wind had faded into a gentle whisper across the distant hills. Samuel leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth from the stove reach his hands. The events of the evening drifted slowly through his thoughts. A stranger arriving at sunset. A meal divided between two people who had never met before. And the quiet promise she had spoken about morning. Out here men heard many kinds of promises. Some were spoken around campfires by travelers who never returned. Others were written in letters from distant banks that claimed ownership of land a man had worked for years. Most promises faded with time like footprints in dry dust. Samuel Whitaker had learned to trust only the sunrise and the weather. Yet something about Ayana's words carried a calm certainty that lingered in the back of his mind. Eventually the long day caught up with him, and his eyes drifted closed. The hours of night passed quietly across the ranch. Sometime after midnight the temperature dropped nearly 20 degrees the way desert air often did, and a cool breath slipped through the cracks in the wooden walls. Samuel stirred briefly and pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders before settling again into light sleep. The stars continued their slow movement across the sky above the plains. Time moved the way it always had in that lonely stretch of Arizona. Slowly and without hurry. Then sometime before dawn Samuel Whitaker woke again. At first he did not know what had pulled him from sleep. The cabin was still dark and the faint gray hint of morning had not yet touched the horizon. He sat up slightly in the chair and listened. The ranch remained quiet, but something had changed. The silence outside no longer felt empty. It felt heavy, as though the land beyond the fence line was holding its breath. Samuel stood and walked quietly toward the door. He opened it just enough to look across the yard. The cool air of early morning brushed his face, and the smell of dry earth drifted through the doorway. For several seconds he saw nothing unusual. The horse still stood near the fence. The hills remained dark shapes against the fading stars. Yet far across the plains something moved. At first it looked like a thin cloud drifting low along the ground. Samuel narrowed his eyes and leaned slightly against the doorframe. The cloud grew wider as he watched. It was dust rising slowly into the pale edge of dawn. Dust did not appear on the plains without reason. A single rider could raise a small trail behind him, but this dust moved like a broad wave spreading. Across the valley floor, Samuel stepped out onto the porch and rested his hands on the railing. The eastern sky had begun to lighten now, revealing the faint outline of the distant land. The dust continued to rise in the distance, stretching wider with every passing minute. Somewhere behind him the cabin door opened softly, and Ayana stepped onto the porch beside him. She looked toward the horizon without surprise. The first light of dawn touched the hills as the dust cloud slowly revealed the shapes moving within it. Dozens of riders traveling across the plains toward the ranch. Samuel Whitaker remained standing on the porch as the first pale light of dawn stretched across the plains, and the shapes inside the rising dust slowly became clearer with every passing second. At first he counted only a handful of riders moving across the valley floor, but the farther the light spread the more figures appeared behind them. What had looked like a drifting cloud was now a wide line of horsemen riding together across the open land. The ground beneath the ranch seemed to carry the faint rhythm of distant hooves, steady and calm, like thunder rolling far away beyond the hills. Samuel rested one hand on the porch railing and narrowed his eyes toward the horizon. Years of watching cattle across wide pastures had trained him to judge distance quickly. The riders were still more than a mile away, but they were moving with quiet purpose, not racing, not wandering, simply riding in a long, steady line that stretched farther than he had first realized. Ayana stood beside him without speaking, her eyes following the same distant movement. The morning air was cool now, nearly 50 degrees after the drop in temperature during the night, and a soft breeze carried the scent of dry grass across the ranch yard. Samuel glanced toward her for a moment. "You were expecting them," he said quietly. Ayana did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched the riders draw closer as the sun slowly pushed above the eastern hills. The first golden light touched the dust drifting behind the horses and turned the rising cloud into a glowing curtain across the plains. "My people travel early when the day is still cool," she said calmly. Samuel folded his arms across his chest. The line of riders had grown clearer now, and he could see the shapes of long spears and blankets across the horses' backs. Some carried bows. Others rode with simple leather saddlebags, but every one of them moved with the same steady rhythm across the land. He counted again, this time more carefully. 10 riders became 20. 20 became 40. Then the line stretched farther, and he realized there were far more than that. The ranch yard remained quiet except for the faint creak of the wooden porch beneath his boots. His old horse near the fence lifted its head and watched the distant movement as well, ears turning toward the growing sound across the plains. Samuel had lived long enough on the frontier to understand what a gathering like this could mean. Groups that large rarely traveled without reason. Sometimes they moved toward new hunting grounds. Sometimes they traveled between distant settlements. But sometimes they came for something far more serious. Samuel did not reach for a rifle or step back inside the cabin. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, leaning lightly against the railing while the morning sun climbed slowly into the sky. Ayanna finally spoke again as the riders came within half a mile of the ranch. "You shared your food when you had little," she said. "Among my people, that kind of kindness travels farther than the wind." Samuel watched the approaching line without moving. The riders had begun to spread slightly now, forming a wide arc across the open land as they approached the ranch property. The dust behind them rolled gently across the grass like a low drifting fog. For a brief moment, Samuel wondered if the entire valley had come alive overnight. He had seen cattle drives with 50 men before, but this was something different. The riders carried themselves with quiet order, as if each man understood exactly where he belonged in the long line. When they reached the edge of the ranch fence, the front riders slowed their horses to an easy walk. The rising sun now lit their faces clearly. Some were older men with long dark hair tied behind their shoulders. Others were younger riders whose eyes moved carefully across the land as they approached. The line continued to grow as more figures emerged from the dust behind them. Samuel finally spoke again, without taking his eyes off the approaching group. "How many of them are there?" he asked. Ayanna answered with the same calm voice she had carried since the night before. "Enough to remember a good deed," she said quietly. The first riders stopped their horses about 30 yards from the porch, and the rest of the long line began to gather behind them, filling the open land around the ranch with the steady presence of dozens upon dozens of mounted figures. Samuel Whitaker stood still on the porch as the long line of riders settled across the open ground in front of his ranch. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting a warm golden light over the valley and revealing the full size of the gathering. What had first looked like a distant cloud of dust had become something far greater. Riders stretched across the plains as far as Samuel could see to the left and right of his fence line. Some remained mounted while others guided their horses into quiet rows behind the first line. The land that had been empty only minutes earlier now held the steady presence of what looked like hundreds of Apache riders. The horses shifted calmly beneath their riders, but none of the men raised their voices. The entire gathering moved with the quiet order of people who understood one another without needing many words. Samuel rested his hands lightly on the porch railing and studied the group carefully. His years on the frontier had taught him not to show fear even when he felt uncertainty. Still, he could not deny the weight of the moment. 30 acres of dry land and one small wooden cabin had never looked so small against the wide presence of so many riders. Beside him, Ayanna remained calm, her eyes moving across the gathering with quiet familiarity. The first rider in the line slowly guided his horse forward until he stopped about 20 feet from the porch steps. He was an older man with long dark hair streaked with gray and a wide leather band across his forehead. His horse stood tall and steady beneath him, a deep chestnut color that gleamed under the morning sun. The man studied Samuel for several seconds with thoughtful eyes that carried the kind of patience that came from many years of watching the world change around him. Then he spoke in a calm voice that carried clearly across the quiet yard. "You are the man who shared his food with the traveler last night." Samuel glanced briefly toward Ayanna before answering. "I shared what little I had," he said simply. The older rider nodded once. Behind him, the long line of Apache riders remained silent, their horses standing in a broad arc around the ranch property. The wind moved lightly through the grass, and the dust from the long ride began to settle slowly back onto the earth. The older man swung one leg over his saddle and stepped down from the horse with careful dignity. He approached the fence line and rested his hand lightly on the wooden rail as if greeting the land itself. Ayanna stepped forward beside Samuel and spoke quietly. "This is Chief Dakota," she said. "He leads my people across these plains." Samuel tipped his hat slightly in greeting. Chief Dakota studied him again, then glanced toward the small cabin behind the porch as though measuring the simple life that existed there. The chief's expression softened slightly before he spoke again. "My daughter arrived here with empty hands and an empty stomach," he said. Yet she tells me you shared your last meal without asking who she was or what she carried with her. Samuel shifted his weight slightly, but kept his voice steady. A hungry traveler does not need many questions, he replied. The chief allowed a faint smile to touch the corners of his mouth. Behind him, several riders exchanged quiet looks as though the words had confirmed something important. For a few moments, no one moved. The wide valley held its breath around the small ranch. Then Chief Takota turned slowly toward the gathering behind him. He raised his hand once in a calm, deliberate motion. What happened next surprised Samuel Whitaker more than the arrival of the riders themselves. One by one, the Apache riders began to step down from their horses. Saddles creaked softly and boots touched the dry earth. The long line of riders moved with quiet respect as they formed rows across the open ground facing the small porch. Then, in a single gentle motion that passed across the valley like a wave, the men lowered themselves onto one knee before the ranch. The morning sun shone across the silent gathering while Chief Takota looked back at Samuel Whitaker with calm, steady eyes. Among my people, he said, a man who shares his last meal is never considered poor. Samuel Whitaker did not move for several seconds as the wide valley filled with the quiet image of hundreds of riders kneeling across the dry earth before his small ranch. The morning sun continued to rise behind them, spreading long golden light across the plains and catching the dust that still drifted gently through the air. The moment carried a strange stillness that Samuel had never experienced before in all his years on that land. Only yesterday the ranch had felt forgotten by the world. 30 acres of dry grass, a tired horse near the fence, and a cabin that had grown silent after too many seasons without rain. Now the same ground held the presence of an entire people gathered in quiet respect. Samuel shifted his weight slightly on the porch boards, the wood creaking beneath his boots. He had faced drought, lonely winters, and more than one uncertain season on the frontier, but nothing had prepared him for the sight unfolding before him. Chief Takota remained standing near the fence rail, his calm eyes studying Samuel as though measuring the depth of a man's character rather than the size of his land. Ayana stood a step behind the chief, her expression peaceful as she watched the rows of riders who had come across the valley. Samuel cleared his throat softly, unsure what words could possibly belong in such a moment. You do not need to kneel for a piece of bread, he said quietly. Chief Takota turned slightly and raised his hand again, signaling the riders to rise. One by one the men stood and brushed the dust from their knees. The horses shifted calmly behind them as the long line of riders returned to their feet. The chief then walked slowly through the open gate of the fence and approached the porch steps. His movements were steady and deliberate, each step taken with the patience of someone who understood the weight of tradition. When he reached the bottom of the porch, he looked up at Samuel Whitaker with quiet respect. Bread shared during a hard season carries more value than gold, the chief said. Ayana stepped forward beside him and placed her hand lightly against the porch railing, looking up at Samuel with the same calm expression she had worn the night before. When a stranger shows kindness without asking for reward, she said softly, the land remembers. Samuel glanced toward the wide gathering of riders again. The valley now seemed alive with quiet movement as several of the men began guiding pack horses toward the ranch yard. Large bundles hung across the backs of the animals, wrapped in thick blankets and tied carefully with leather straps. Samuel frowned slightly, unsure what he was witnessing. Chief Takota noticed the confusion in his expression and allowed a faint smile to appear. My daughter told our people what you did when she arrived before dawn, the chief explained. She told them how a rancher who had little still chose to divide his last meal with someone he did not know. Samuel leaned one shoulder against the porch post and folded his arms. That was just supper, he said. A traveler needed food, and I had food. Chief Takota shook his head gently. Among my people such a choice carries meaning. He turned and gestured toward the riders now entering the ranch yard with their pack horses. Several men began unloading the bundles onto the dry ground near the cabin. One by one the blankets were opened, revealing sacks of grain, dried meat, fresh corn, and leather bags filled with beans. Others carried tools, coils of rope, and small wooden crates. Samuel stared at the growing pile with quiet disbelief. Within minutes the small empty yard beside the cabin held more supplies than he had seen in months. Ayana watched his reaction with a soft smile that held both gratitude and pride. You gave what you had when the land was hard, she said gently. Now our people return what the land has given us. The morning sun climbed higher across the plains while the Apache riders continued their careful work, bringing forward more bundles and placing them neatly beside the porch. Samuel Whitaker looked out across the valley once more, realizing that the same 30 acres that had felt empty yesterday now stood at the center of something far greater than he had ever expected. Samuel Whitaker stood quietly on the porch while the morning sun continued to rise over the wide Arizona plains, its warm light stretching across the dry grass and the scattered bundles that now filled the once empty yard beside his cabin. The ranch looked different than it had the day before. Where there had only been dust and silence, there were now rows of supplies carefully placed beside the fence and near the small barn that had stood and used for months. Sacks of grain rested against the wooden posts, leather bags of beans sat beside crates of corn, and bundles of dried meat hung neatly from a rope stretched between two fence rails. Even the old horse near the pasture seemed more awake now, lifting its head and watching the quiet movement of the Apache riders with calm curiosity. Samuel rested one hand against the porch post and looked across the yard slowly, trying to take in everything that had happened since sunrise. The ranch that had once felt forgotten by the world now carried the steady presence of hundreds of riders who had crossed miles of desert simply to answer a small act of kindness. Chief Dakota stood near the open gate speaking quietly with several of the older riders, while others finished placing the last of the supplies near the cabin steps. The entire gathering moved with quiet order, as though each person understood exactly what role they had come to play. Ayanna remained beside the porch, her eyes following the work of her people while the gentle breeze moved through her dark hair. Samuel finally spoke after a long moment of silence. "I only shared a meal," he said slowly. "That does not seem like a thing that should fill a whole valley with riders." Ayanna looked toward him, and the soft smile returned to her face. "Sometimes a small kindness travels farther than the man who offered it," she replied. Samuel considered her words while watching the last of the bundles being carried from the pack horses. Chief Dakota approached the porch once more, stopping at the bottom step with the same calm dignity he had carried since arriving. The chief looked across the ranch yard and then toward the wide plains beyond the fence line. "Your land has been quiet for a long time," he said. "The drought has made it difficult for many who live here." Samuel nodded slowly. "The rain has forgotten this part of Arizona for 2 years now," he answered. Chief Dakota turned his eyes back toward him. "But a man who still shares his last meal during a hard season is not a man who stands alone," the chief said. Samuel looked across the valley again. The riders had begun, preparing to leave now that their work was finished. Saddles were tightened, blankets secured, and horses guided back into long lines that stretched across the open land. The gathering that had filled the valley so suddenly was slowly becoming a moving horizon once more. Ayanna stepped closer to the porch rail and looked out at the riders as well. "When the sun reaches its highest point today, my people will be many miles from this place again," she said quietly. "But the story of this ranch will travel with them." Samuel rested his hat against his chest for a moment while watching the first riders begin to guide their horses back toward the distant hills. He had lived many years believing that the frontier was a place where a man survived only through his own strength. Yet the sight before him now suggested something different. Sometimes survival came from simple choices made when no one else was watching. Chief Dakota placed one hand gently against the fence post before turning toward his horse. "Remember this, Samuel Whitaker," he said calmly. "Out here on the plains a man is never measured by how much land he owns or how much food sits on his table. He is measured by what he chooses to share when times are hardest." The chief mounted his horse and joined the line of riders as they began moving slowly across the valley. Within minutes the long procession was already drifting toward the distant hills, their shapes growing smaller beneath the bright morning sky. Samuel Whitaker remained standing on the porch long after the last rider disappeared into the rising dust. The ranch was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. Around him the supplies left by the riders rested in the sunlight, enough to carry the ranch through many seasons. Samuel placed his hat back on his head and looked across the 30 acres of land that had once seemed so small and forgotten. The wind moved gently through the dry grass, and the old horse near the fence lowered its head to graze. For the first time in many months, Samuel Whitaker felt something return to the land that had almost been lost. Hope.